Welcome to this video on Cogency. This is our second video in which we are evaluating inductive arguments. The first video that you should watch, which deals with the evaluation of inductive arguments, is the last video on strength. And by evaluation of inductive arguments here, I mean determining whether the inductive argument is good or not. So that means obviously that cogency will only apply to inductive arguments. Okay, so the definition of cogency is pretty straightforward. An argument is cogent if it is strong and the premises are true. So notice that we have two conditions that are necessary here in order for the argument to be cogent. The premises need to be true, but the argument also needs to be strong. Notice that this corresponds nicely to deductive arguments in which we had two conditions necessary for soundness, right? That was validity and true premises. Here we have two conditions for cogency, and both conditions have to be met if the argument is to be cogent. Here's an example. Most ravens observed so far are black, therefore the next raven to be observed will also be black. Okay, this is a cogent argument. The premise here is true, that most ravens observed so far are black. By the way, not all ravens observed have been black. There have been some which have been albinos, but that's a very small fraction, very, very small percentage. So it is true that most ravens observed so far are black. Well, we have that condition met of the premises being true, but we also have the condition met of the argument being strong. I suspect that there have been a lot, thousands, maybe millions of ravens that have been observed so far. And so if most of them have been black, then the likelihood of the next one to be observed that the next one to be observed is black will be very good, right? The probability or chance of that will be very high, which is to say that the argument is strong, because that's the definition of strength, remember, is when the likelihood or probability is very good or very high. Okay, so that's an example of a cogent argument. Let's look at uncogent arguments and how do we know when we have them? Well, if you think about it, if by definition cogency requires two conditions, if it requires strength and it also requires that the premises are true, then there will only be three ways in which an argument can be uncogent. One way is if the argument is weak, right? If it's not strong, then one of those conditions is missing, and so by definition it will not be cogent. So here's an example of that. I am 40 years old, I have had oxygen to breathe my whole life, therefore tomorrow I will not have oxygen to breathe. Okay, as we saw in our last video, this is a weak argument. And so because it is weak, it is not cogent, because we do need the argument to be strong and the premises to be true in order for the argument to be cogent. The second way in which an argument can be uncogent is if the premises are false. And that's what we have in this other example. All asteroids observed so far have contained chocolate fudge inside of them. Therefore, the next asteroid to be observed will also contain chocolate fudge inside of it. Notice that this is a strong argument. That is because if it were true that all asteroids observed so far have contained chocolate fudge inside of them, then the likelihood or the probability of the next one containing chocolate fudge inside of it would be high, right? Because it is assumed here that we have observed a lot of asteroids. The problem here is that we know that it is false that all asteroids observed so far have contained chocolate fudge inside of them. No matter how many of us would want that to be true, we know that that's just false. And because that is false, we have a case here in which the premises are false. We only have one premise here, but the premise is false, and so we cannot have this argument cannot be cogent. Okay, the last case would be then in which both conditions fail. This would be the case in which the argument is weak and the premises are false. So here's an example of that. Two asteroids observed so far contain chocolate fudge inside of them. Therefore, the next asteroid to be observed will also contain chocolate fudge. Okay, this argument is weak, and the reason why it is weak because we're predicting something about the next asteroid based on only two asteroids, right? That's a very low number or low sample for us to be making a generalization or to be predicting the next what the next one will be like. So that's why it's weak. We would need thousands or millions of asteroids in order for us to have a strong claim here meaning that the probability will be high. So this is a weak argument, but we also know that the premise here is false, right? It is not true that any asteroid has contained chocolate fudge inside of it, so it can't be true that two of them have contained chocolate fudge. So this argument fails in terms of both conditions, right? It is weak and the premises are false. Okay, that is it for our video. We have now successfully completed everything that we're covering in Chapter 1, and we shall be moving forward. Thank you for joining.